Imagine for a moment that you're rushing through the airport, late for your flight, carrying heavy luggage, worried only about your own problems. You quickly pass by an elderly man in a blue uniform, mopping the floor with an old, worn-out mop. His graying hair is slightly disheveled. His calloused hands grip the wooden handle firmly. He works in silence, almost invisible among the crowd rushing back and forth. To you, he's just another janitor, someone you wouldn't even notice on a normal day. But what you don't know is that this ordinary man, this silent custodian, carries with him a story that would completely change your perception of heroes of sacrifice, and of how sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most common places. This is the true story of Harold Thompson, a war veteran who chose a simple life after living through moments that defined the destiny of an entire generation. Before we continue with this incredible story that will move you and make you rethink everything about judgments and appearances, I need to ask you something very important. If you enjoy real stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on life, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. This really helps me continue bringing these extraordinary stories to you. And don't forget to leave your like, because every thumbs up shows that these stories truly matter. Now let us get back to Harold and discover why trained soldiers stopped completely when they saw just a small medal on his chest. It was a Tuesday morning like any other at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The traffic was heavy, as always, with thousands of passengers running between terminals, dragging suitcases, checking flight schedules on electronic boards, buying overpriced coffee at convenience stores, and complaining about delays and endless lines. In the midst of this chaotic symphony of voices, public address announcements, and the sound of suitcase wheels on the marble floor, Harold Thompson began his shift at 5:30 in the morning, just like he had done for the past 12 years. At 78 years old, Harold moved with the steady pace of someone who had learned that life wasn't a race, but rather a marathon that required endurance, patience, and quiet dignity. His blue janitor's uniform was always impeccably clean, and pressed his name tag slightly crooked from years of wear and pinned just below it, almost hidden by the fabric fold, was a small bronze star that most people never noticed. But this wasn't just any medal. This was the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Army. And Harold Thompson had earned it in the jungles of Vietnam more than 50 years ago. Harold never talked about the war, not to his co-workers, not to his supervisors, not even to his late wife Martha, who had passed away 3 years earlier. The memories were locked away in a part of his heart that he had learned to keep closed, like a door that should never be opened. He had come home from Vietnam in 1969, a young man at 25 who had seen things that no human being should ever see, who had done things that haunted his dreams for decades, and who had made split-second decisions that saved lives but cost him pieces of his soul. When he returned to Chicago, all he wanted was to disappear into the anonymity of civilian life, to find work that didn't require him to make life or death decisions, to build a simple existence, where the loudest sound he heard was the gentle hum of floor cleaning machines instead of the deafening roar of helicopter rotors and explosions. The choice to work as a janitor at the airport was made out of lack of options or education. Harold had been offered a position with the VA, had been encouraged to apply for government jobs that would have recognized his military service, had been told by well-meaning friends and family that he was wasting his potential by choosing manual labor. But Harold knew something they didn't understand. He knew that after what he had experienced in the war, after the weight of command and the burden of keeping men alive in impossible circumstances, there was a profound peace in simple, honest work. There was dignity in making sure that travelers had clean floors to walk on, that the restrooms were spotless, that the windows sparkled so clearly that arriving passengers could see their loved ones waiting for them without obstruction. Every day, Harold arrived before dawn and left after sunset, methodically working his way through Terminal B, paying attention to details that no one else noticed, taking pride in work that most people considered beneath them. His routine was sacred and unwavering. First, he would check all the restrooms, replacing paper towels and toilet paper, mopping floors, cleaning mirrors until they reflected perfectly. Then he would move to the seating areas, wiping down chairs, cleaning tables, emptying trash cans that overflowed with coffee cups, newspapers, and the debris of human travel. After lunch, he would focus on the main walkways, the high-traffic areas where thousands of feet walked every day, where spilled drinks and dropped food created a constant need for attention. Throughout all of this, Harold moved with quiet efficiency, speaking only when spoken to, nodding politely to the security guards who had grown to respect his consistency, smiling gently at the occasional child who waved at him from their parents' arms. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something different was going to happen, something that would crack open the carefully constructed wall that Harold had built around his past, and remind him that some things can never truly be hidden, no matter how deeply we bury them. As Harold was cleaning near gate B-17, focused on removing a stubborn stain from the carpet, he heard the distinctive sound of military boots on the marble floor. The rhythm was unmistakable to someone who had spent years around soldiers, sharp, precise, synchronized. Harold looked up to see a group of 6 young soldiers in dress uniforms walking through the terminal. They were clearly on leave or traveling for official business, their posture straight, their uniforms immaculate, their faces carrying that particular expression of young service members who are still proud of what they represent, but haven't yet been tested by the harsh realities that Harold knew too well. The soldiers were talking quietly among themselves, probably discussing their travel plans or sharing stories about their base, when one of them, a young sergeant with kind eyes and a slight smile, noticed Harold working nearby. Military personnel are trained to be observant, to notice details that civilians miss, and Sergeant Martinez had always been particularly good at reading people. He saw an elderly man in a janitor's uniform working diligently, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he carried himself, that caught the sergeant's attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Harold moved with a bearing that spoke of military training, even after all these years. Sergeant Martinez approached Harold with the respectful demeanor that good soldiers show to their elders, intending to simply nod politely and perhaps thank him for keeping the airport clean. But as he got closer, his eyes were drawn to the small medal pinned to Harold's uniform, almost hidden beneath his name tag. At first glance, it looked like a company service pin or a length of service award, the kind of thing that civilian employees often receive for years of dedicated work. But something about the bronze color, the distinctive shape, made Martinez look more closely. His steps slowed as recognition dawned on him, and then stopped completely as he realized what he was seeing: the Distinguished Service Cross. Martinez had studied military decorations extensively during his training, had memorized the hierarchy of medals and what they represented, but he had never actually seen one in person. He knew that the DSC was awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat, that it ranked just below the Medal of Honor in significance, that most recipients were either dead or had become legends in military history books. And here was one, pinned quietly to the uniform of an airport janitor who was kneeling on the floor, scrubbing carpet stains with the same dedication that he had probably once applied to missions that saved lives. Martinez's sudden stop caused his fellow soldiers to pause and look back, wondering why he had broken formation. They followed his gaze to the elderly man who continued working, apparently unaware that he had become the center of attention. Sergeant Williams, the ranking NCO in the group, stepped forward to see what had captured Martinez's attention, and when he saw the medal, his face went pale with recognition. Without a word, he raised his hand, signaling for the other soldiers to join them, and within moments, all 6 young men were standing in a semicircle around Harold Thompson, their earlier conversations forgotten, their attention completely focused on this small piece of bronze that represented acts of heroism they could barely imagine. Harold became aware of the silence around him before he looked up. The ambient noise of the airport seemed to fade as he realized that someone was standing very close to him, not moving, not speaking. When he finally raised his head, he found himself looking into the faces of 6 soldiers, all staring at his chest with expressions of awe, respect, and something approaching reverence. For a moment, Harold felt confused, wondering if he had somehow broken a security protocol, or if there was an emergency. He hadn't noticed, but then he saw where their eyes were focused, saw them looking at the medal he had worn for so many years that he sometimes forgot it was there, and he understood immediately what was happening. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Harold slowly stood up, his 78-year-old body protesting slightly, but his military bearing reasserting itself instinctively. Decades of civilian life fell away in an instant, and for just a moment, he was once again Lieutenant Harold Thompson, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, the man who had earned that medal in a place called Firebase Charlie. During the worst fighting of the Vietnam War, the soldiers could see the transformation, could recognize the unmistakable presence of a combat veteran. someone who had been tested in ways they were still training for. Sergeant Martinez was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, is that a Distinguished Service Cross?" Harold nodded slowly, his throat suddenly tight with emotions he had kept buried for decades. "Yes, it is." The simple acknowledgement sent a ripple through the group of young soldiers. They had been taught about the DSC in their military education, had heard stories about the kind of courage it represented, but they had never expected to encounter someone who had actually earned one, especially not in an airport terminal, especially not wearing a janitor's uniform. Sergeant Williams, as the senior man, knew what protocol demanded in this situation. Without hesitation, he brought himself to attention and rendered a perfect salute, his hands sharp and precise, his eyes locked on Harold's. The other 5 soldiers immediately followed suit, creating a wall of respect and recognition that transformed that small section of the airport terminal into something approaching sacred ground. Passengers walking by began to notice the unusual scene, some stopping to watch, others pulling out phones to capture a moment they didn't fully understand, but somehow recognized as significant. Harold stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the flood of memories and emotions that the salute had triggered. He had not been saluted in more than 50 years, had not been recognized as a soldier since he had turned in his uniform and walked away from military life forever. His hand moved slowly, almost reluctantly, to return the salute, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. When his hand touched his forehead in that familiar gesture, something inside him cracked open. And for the first time in decades, Harold Thompson allowed himself to remember not just the horror and the loss, but also the brotherhood, the pride, and the sense of purpose that had defined the best parts of his military service. The story of how Harold Thompson earned that Distinguished Service Cross began to unfold in the respectful questions that the young soldiers asked, questions he found himself answering despite years of silence. It was February 14th, 1969, that Firebase Charlie was under siege by a regiment of North Vietnamese Army regulars who had been planning the attack for months. Harold was a lieutenant then, just 24 years old, responsible for a platoon of 38 men who had been in country for varying lengths of time, but who had learned to trust each other with their lives. The firebase was strategically important, sitting on a hilltop that controlled access to 3 major supply routes that the enemy needed to use for their planned offensive. The attack began at 0300 hours with a mortar barrage that lit up the night sky and sent everyone scrambling for cover. Harold's platoon was responsible for the eastern perimeter, the side of the hill that offered the best approach for infantry assault. And within minutes of the first mortar round, they could hear movement in the jungle below, the sound of many men moving carefully but quickly up the steep slope toward their position. The firefight that followed lasted for 14 hours, a brutal test of endurance, ammunition, and that pushed every man to the absolute limit of human capacity. By dawn, Harold's platoon had been reduced to 18 effective fighters, with the rest either killed or wounded too badly to continue fighting. Their ammunition was running critically low, their radio had been destroyed by shrapnel, and the enemy forces seemed inexhaustible. Wave after wave of disciplined soldiers who knew that taking Firebase Charlie would give them control of the entire region. It was then that Harold made the decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Rather than wait for the final assault that would overrun their position, he chose to lead a counterattack, to take the fight to the enemy while his men still had enough ammunition. For one coordinated push, the counterattack that Harold led down the eastern slope of Firebase Charlie became the stuff of military legend, though Harold never knew it because he never read the after-action reports or the history books that would later analyze what happened that morning. With 17 men following him, Harold charged into an enemy force that outnumbered them at least for 2-1, using surprise and desperate courage to create chaos in the enemy ranks. They fought their way through 3 defensive positions, disrupting the enemy's coordination and buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive by helicopter. Harold himself accounted for the destruction of 2 machine gun nests and the capture of enemy intelligence documents that would later prove crucial in preventing a larger offensive. But the cost was devastating. Of the 17 men who followed him down that hill, only 6 returned alive, and Harold carried the weight of those 11 names for every day that followed. The Distinguished Service Cross was awarded for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. But Harold knew that heroism was just another word for surviving when better men didn't, for making impossible choices and living with the consequences. As Harold shared pieces of this story With the young soldiers gathered around him, his voice remained steady and quiet, but his hands shook slightly as memories that he had kept locked away came flooding back. The soldiers listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were hearing something sacred, something that connected them to the long tradition of service and sacrifice that they had volunteered to join. They began to understand that this elderly janitor represented everything they hoped to become and everything they feared they might have to endure. Other airport employees had begun to notice the unusual gathering, and word spread quickly through the terminal that something significant was happening near Gate B-17. Airport security initially approached to make sure there was no problem, but when they saw the respectful nature of the interaction and recognized the military protocol being observed, they maintained a discreet distance. While ensuring that the conversation could continue without interruption, passengers began to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that they were witnessing something important even if they didn't understand the full context. Captain Reynolds, the airport's head of security and himself a retired Marine, was called to the scene and immediately recognized both the significance of Harold S. medal and the appropriate respect being shown by the young soldiers. He quietly coordinated with airport staff to create a buffer zone around the group, ensuring that their conversation could continue without being disturbed by the normal chaos of airport operations. This simple act of understanding and respect allowed what had begun as a chance encounter to develop into something much more meaningful. Harold found himself telling stories he had never told anyone, sharing memories that had been locked away for 5 decades. He talked about his men, about their faces and their names, about their dreams of home and their fears about tomorrow. He talked about the weight of command, about making decisions when there were no good options, about the impossible mathematics of warfare where success was measured in lives saved rather than lives lost. The young soldiers hung on every word, beginning to understand the real cost of the medals and ribbons they wore on their own uniforms, beginning to grasp the weight of the responsibility they had accepted when they took their oath of enlistment. But Harold also talked about coming home, about the difficulty of transitioning from a world where life and death decisions were made every day to a civilian world that seemed trivial and meaningless by comparison. He talked about the isolation he felt, the sense that no one could understand what he had experienced, the way that normal conversations about weather and sports seemed absurd after what he had seen. He explained how he had chosen janitorial work not because he couldn't do anything else, but because there was something healing about work that had visible, immediate results, work that contributed to the comfort and safety of others, without requiring him to make the kind of decisions that haunted his dreams. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with the young soldiers asking respectful questions, and Harold sharing insights about leadership, about courage, about the true meaning of service that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training manual. Other veterans in the airport began to notice what was happening, and several approached to pay their respects to Harold, creating an impromptu gathering of men and women who understood the significance of that small bronze medal and what it represented. Among those who joined the group was Master Sergeant Johnson, a career soldier who was traveling home on leave, and who immediately recognized Harold as someone whose service deserved the highest respect. Johnson had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, had earned his own decorations for valor, but he understood the historical significance of Harold S. Distinguished Service Cross and the particular weight carried by veterans of the Vietnam War who had served with distinction in an unpopular conflict and returned home to indifference or hostility rather than gratitude. As the morning progressed and Harold's shift supervisor became aware of the situation, there was concern about whether Harold was neglecting his duties or creating a disruption in airport operations. But when the supervisor, a man named Tom Bradley, who had worked with Harold for 8 years, saw the respectful gathering of military personnel and learned about Harold's background, for the first time, his perspective changed completely. Tom realized that in all their years of working together, Harold had never mentioned his military service, had never asked for special recognition or accommodation, had simply shown up every day and done his job with quiet professionalism. The revelation of Harold's background began to spread through the airport staff, creating a new understanding of the man they had worked alongside for more than a decade, without truly knowing. Maintenance workers, security guards, customer service representatives, and managers began to stop by the gathering near Gate B-17, not to interrupt, but to see for themselves this extraordinary man who had been hiding in plain sight among them. Many of them felt a sense of shame for never having recognized Harold's service, for never having shown him the respect he deserved for treating him as just another employee, rather than as a hero who had earned his place in American military history. But Harold, with characteristic humility, deflected attention from himself and focused on the young soldiers who had initiated this unexpected reunion with his military past. He asked about their training, their assignments, their families back home. He shared practical advice about leadership under pressure, about taking care of soldiers, about the importance of preparation and attention to detail. He spoke about the evolution of military equipment and tactics since his time in Vietnam, showing genuine interest in how the Army had changed and improved over the decades since his service. The most powerful moment of the entire encounter came when Harold, looking at the faces of these young soldiers, who represented the continuation of the military tradition he had once been part of, began to talk about what their service meant to the country and to civilians like the airport, passengers who walked by without understanding the sacrifice that military service represents. He talked about the covenant between soldiers and society, about how military personnel voluntarily accept risks and hardships so that others can live in safety and freedom. His words carried the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had paid the ultimate price for understanding these truths. As the conversation began to wind down, Sergeant Martinez asked Harold if he had any final advice for young soldiers who were just beginning their careers. Harold paused for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered how to distill decades of experience and reflection into words that could truly matter. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean closer to hear him clearly. Harold told them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. He told them that true leadership wasn't about giving orders, but about being willing to sacrifice for the people under their command. He explained that the real test of a soldier wasn't how they performed in combat, but how they treated their fellow human beings in all circumstances. He reminded them that they represented something larger than themselves, that their conduct and character reflected on every person who had ever worn the uniform, and that this responsibility should be carried with pride but never with arrogance. But perhaps most importantly, Harold told them that their service would change them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, and that they should embrace that transformation rather than resist it. He explained that military service would teach them things about themselves, about others, and about life that civilian experience could never provide, and that these lessons would serve them well long after they returned to civilian life. He encouraged them to stay connected to their military family, to support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, and to never forget that their shared experience of service created bonds that would last a lifetime. As the young soldiers prepared to continue to their gate, each one approached Harold individually to shake his hand and express their gratitude for his service and for sharing his story with them. The handshakes were firm and meaningful, each one representing a bridge between generations of American military service, a connection between the sacrifices of the past and the commitment of the present. Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of continuity, of feeling that his service had meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of war, that it was part of a larger story of duty and dedication that continued through these young men and women. The last soldier to shake Harold's hand was Sergeant Martinez, the young man whose sharp eyes had first noticed the Distinguished Service Cross and started this entire encounter. Martinez paused longer than the others, seeming to struggle with words adequate to express his feelings. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you, sir, for showing us what it really means to serve." Harold smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in years, and replied, "Thank you for reminding me that it still matters." After the soldiers departed for their flight, Harold stood alone in the terminal for several minutes, overwhelmed by the emotions and memories that had been stirred up by the encounter. The carefully constructed barriers he had built around his military service had been breached, and he wasn't sure how to rebuild them, or even if he wanted to. For the first time in decades, he felt a connection to that part of his identity he had tried so hard to suppress, and he wondered if perhaps it was time to stop hiding from his past and start integrating it with his present. The word of Harold's story spread throughout the airport that day and beyond, eventually reaching local news media and veteran organizations who wanted to honor him for his service. But Harold, true to his character, deflected most of the attention, preferring to return to his quiet routine of maintaining the cleanliness and order that made the airport a more pleasant place for travelers. However, he did agree to one change. He moved his Distinguished Service Cross from its hidden position beneath his name tag to a more visible place on his uniform, where other veterans could see it and know that they were not alone in the civilian world. Harold Thompson continued working as a janitor at Chicago O'Hare International Airport until his retirement 2 years later at the age of 80. During those final 2 years, he became something of a legend among the airport staff and the military personnel who regularly passed through the terminal. Young soldiers would seek him out for advice. Veteran travelers would stop to thank him for his service, and airport employees would point him out to visitors as an example of the heroes who work quietly among us every day. But perhaps more importantly, Harold began to open up about his experiences, in small ways sharing stories with coworkers, participating in veteran events, and slowly allowing himself to reclaim the part of his identity that he had buried for so many years. He learned that hiding from his past had not diminished its impact on his life, but had instead prevented him from processing and integrating those experiences in healthy ways. The recognition he received from those young soldiers that day at the airport had given him permission to be proud of his service again, to see it as something that added to rather than detracted from his civilian accomplishments. The story of Harold Thompson reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most ordinary circumstances, doing the most mundane jobs, living the most humble lives. It challenges us to look more carefully at the people around us, to recognize that everyone has a story, that everyone has faced challenges and overcome obstacles that we know nothing about. It teaches us that true service isn't about recognition or reward, but about the quiet satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than ourselves, whether that contribution happens on a battlefield or in an airport terminal. Most importantly, Harold's story demonstrates the power of respect and recognition to heal old wounds and restore dignity to lives that have been diminished by time and circumstance. Those young soldiers didn't just see a medal that day. They saw a man whose sacrifices had made their own service possible, whose example had helped define the standards they were trying to meet. Their simple act of recognition transformed both Harold's understanding of his own worth and their appreciation for the legacy they had inherited as American military personnel. This is why we must never forget that heroism comes in many forms, that courage is displayed not only in moments of dramatic action, but also in the daily choice to serve others with dignity and dedication. Harold Thompson was a hero twice, first as a young lieutenant who risked everything to save his men in the jungles of Vietnam, and again as an elderly janitor who showed us all what it means to find purpose and meaning in honest work and quiet service. His story will continue to inspire long after his mop and uniform have been put away for the final time, reminding us that the true measure of a person isn't found in titles or recognition, but in the impact they have on the lives of others and the legacy they leave behind.